Hi, this is Saransh Garg here again. In the next interview, we will be doing the market entry solar lantern case with a different candidate. The candidate does reasonably well, though he stumbles in certain situations. One thing to really take away from this case is how effectively the candidate is using his sheet of paper to lay out his structure clearly for himself as well as for communicating clearly with the interviewer. Hi Ashay, how are you doing?
I'm fine, Saransh.
So let's get started with your first case. Our client is a German manufacturer and they're looking to enter the Indian market with solar lantern being their primary product. And they've asked us to investigate if this would be a good idea or not.
Okay. Great. So just have a couple of questions to clarify the exact problem. So the manufacturer is currently operating only in Germany, and they're looking to expand into the Indian market. So
Correct.
we're talking about all of India or any particular
Yes,
region?
all of India.
And solar lanterns is the only product, the one product.
Correct.
That we're talking about. All right. So how would we measure whether this investment would be a good idea? Would that be through profits, or is there a period in which we want to break even?
That's a good question. So let's compute the profits that we can get for the first 2 years, and based on that, we can make an assessment if the client thinks that's attractive or not.
Okay. All right. So that I think that clarifies the exact problem. So I'll just take a moment to structure the problem.
Sure.
Okay, so essentially, I'd like to look at two aspects. First is the profit, and the mathematical formulation for that, whether we'll actually be able to make profit in the first 2 years. And second would be the value chain implementation, whether we can actually implement the various aspects of the business, and whether we'll face any barriers in doing that. So starting off with the profit, essentially it would depend on 4 or 5 factors. That would be market size, market share, and the profit per unit.
All right.
Finally, taking out the initial investment. So I'd like to start off by estimating market size.
All right, sounds like a good idea. The candidate has done an excellent job of stating his overall approach and breaking it down into its various components. However, in terms of the preliminary questions he asked earlier, he could have done a better job. He could have asked questions around where is the geography within India where the client is expecting to sell their product. Also, he could have asked a bit more of how does the solar lantern work, what are its benefits for the customers, and so forth.
So essentially, I think we should start off with understanding a bit about the product and which people we're targeting. So I'd like to first know who are the people that will be using this product. I think it will be those people who require an alternative to illumination. So that would mean particularly in rural areas where there's a lack of electricity, where there's a lack of current alternative forms of lighting.
Right, I think that's fair to say. So, I guess the biggest market would be in places which don't have electricity or have insufficient electricity, and this can be a low cost solution
Okay.
for that purpose.
So I'd like to find out. So also one more question would be, would this be a product which is typically used in a household or individually?
So this
Each
is
family.
this is I guess a product that would be used in a household.
And usually it's one lantern per household.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption.
Okay, so essentially I'd like to start off with the population and break it down into these and figure out the exact segments we're going to be looking at,
All right.
which we'll be targeting for the product. So essentially we'll start with the population. So can I assume 1 billion for population in India?
Fair. Let's make that simplifying assumption.
Okay, so I'd first like to break it down into urban and rural. Seems to be quite a significant divide in the electricity in each of those.
Fair enough.
Do we know the split in the population?
Why don't you take a guess?
Okay, I think it'd be 30% urban and 70% rural.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So essentially, we are, at this point we need to assess whether the urban population would require electricity. As far as I can tell, at this point we should break it down into income streams.
You were looking at urban first?
Urban. We'll start with urban and then come back to rural as well.
All right.
So essentially, I'd like to see which economic streams will actually be able to afford the product.
Right. But if you just step back from affordability and we look at need, do you think in urban areas there would be a need for our product?
Right. So I think here, where there is sufficient electricity, there would not be as high demand for the product. So that said, can we assume that in urban areas there is sufficient electricity for all the entire population?
Yeah, I guess we can make that assumption. Yeah.
Okay, great. So in that case, we'll be looking only at the rural portion of the population. So at this point, we'll have to see which customer segments actually have electricity and what amount of electricity they have, whether they would actually require the solar lantern in the first place. So here I'd like to segment into the three or four income segments. So I'd like to consider upper, middle, and lower.
So what other factors would you use apart from income to make your assessment?
So there would be, first of all, whether a person should buy the product at all, whether they have a need for it. After that would come...
And that would depend on?
That would depend on their... for example, that would depend on where they live, rural, urban. Second,
so we already have that. We're talking only about rural.
Second, it would depend on whether they have sufficient electricity in that region. So even in rural population, that is very dynamic. It depends on where you live and what your income is, whether you have sufficient electricity.
Right.
And third would be whether there are alternatives to the product.
Fair enough. This sounds good. Let's go ahead.
Okay. So essentially upper, middle, and lower. So do we know the percentage split of this population?
Why don't you make a...
Okay, I think it would be 10, 50, 40.
Fine, let's go with that.
Okay. So at this point, we'll have to see whether there is sufficient electricity. Typically, the higher the income, generally people tend to have a higher percentage of electricity coverage in the day. So do we know how much electricity coverage each of these segments has?
We'll have to make reasonable assumptions here. So why don't you go ahead with that?
Okay. I think the upper class will probably have electricity coverage most of the time, so maybe 100% coverage. The middle class may have coverage 50% of the time, 50 to 70% of the time, and lower class probably around 20 to 30%.
All right. But isn't there a scenario where you might have a middle class person living in area of electricity? All right, fair enough. So we made those assumptions.
Taking an average over the entire rural population.
Okay, fine. The candidate is making good use of his paper. He is enabling the interviewer to understand his approach. The candidate is writing neatly and also outlining his approach clearly in a systematic manner. I guess 20% seems to be slightly underestimating. We can probably keep it at around 30%. Let's say 40%. Okay, go ahead.
So essentially, so this is one aspect, whether they have electricity coverage.
All right.
These are the people that would benefit. The people that do not have that coverage will be the people that benefit from the product. So now we need to assess the need for the product, whether or not, although there is less coverage, would a family actually require the product at all? For example, in the middle class, there may be their families are much larger, and you typically need electricity coverage at various times in the day. So I'd like to understand for each of these segments what their needs are, what their specific requirement is in terms of lighting and electricity, and where this product fits into that requirement.
So the kind of lighting this product provides, it provides 8 hours of illumination when it's fully charged, and for it to be fully charged, it requires 6 hours of sunlight.
Okay, so that's 8 hours is quite significant. So that would probably, in general, electricity does not go out the entire time of the day. So 8 hours would cover a significant portion of the night as well. So at this point, we'll have to see, okay, for the middle class and for the lower class, whether they require that illumination.
So how would you go forward?
Right. So let's see. We have to have a qualitative understanding of why they require electricity in the first place, why they require illumination.
So I think we've already made an assessment of 50% of the population having access to electricity and 50% not. So let's consider that 50% is our market, because
Okay.
all of them don't have electricity.
Right.
So they would be needing our product.
All right. Okay, so at this point, the next step would be whether they'll be able to afford the product, each of these segments. So we'll have to see what their typical income is, average income
Okay.
per household,
All right.
and then compare that with the price of our product.
All right.
So I'd like to know what the price, what is the expected price at which we're going to sell this
So
product.
we are thinking of a price of around 6,000 rupees for our product.
Okay. And the lifetime of the product?
So around 2 years.
Okay, for 2 years. And does this product require any maintenance or any after purchase?
Not really. It's a product which will last effectively for 2 years.
Okay. No additional charges then. Great. So I want to know what the average incomes are of each of these segments. So at this point, I think it's safe to rule out the upper portion, since they probably have alternatives. They have electricity at all points.
Fair enough.
So the middle class and lower class, I have an idea. I think I have a rough idea what their average income would be. I believe for middle class it would be around 20,000 rupees, and for lower class it would be around 10,000 rupees.
This is an
Average
income?
household income.
All right. On a per monthly basis?
Yes, bro.
Fine.
Okay. So now at this point, now that we have the numbers in mind in terms of income and in terms of price, we can check whether each of these segments would be able to afford the product.
Okay. How would you go about that?
So we have to see what percentage of this income is used for expenditures apart from daily requirements.
Okay.
So that would mean eliminating food, clothing, shelter, and other such daily and monthly requirements. How much of that portion do they get to see? Do they get to keep? What
Okay.
portion of it is?
So let's do it for middle class, and then we can make an assumption for lower.
Okay. So the saved amount or percentage of the income. So I think that in the middle class there is a significant portion of money that people tend to keep aside as savings. I think that would be around 25 to 30% of their monthly income.
Okay.
And for lower class, it's probably much lower.
So let's stick to middle class for now,
Okay.
and let's see what percentage of the population can afford
Okay,
within
sure.
middle class.
Okay, so essentially 6,000 would be spread across 2 years.
Okay.
Since this is monthly income, I like to see, okay, in 2 years, what is the price per month?
But they would be paying for it upfront, right? The 6,000 rupees.
That is correct. So, I mean, we could look into some alternatives in case this 6,000 turns out to be a little too much,
Alternatives like?
such as EMI, a monthly
Okay.
payment. Or
Fair
for
enough.
2 years.
So that's a good idea. So then let's go ahead with a let's say we have a EMI scheme available.
Okay.
that spreads out the cost of 6,000 rupees over 24 months.
So that would average out to around 300 per month. Just a moment. That's around 250 per month.
Okay.
Okay. So for the middle class, I believe that since savings would be around 25%, that's approximately 5,000 rupees. So early on in those 2 years, families would typically be able to afford it, 6,000 rupees as a down payment, initial payment itself. So this 6,000 is quite comparable to the 5,000 that is saved each month. So they would definitely be able to afford it.
So the savings that are meant, the savings that the middle class uses would be used for purchasing. Part of it would be used for purchasing solar land. All right.
So I mean, within the course of 2 months, they would have 10,000 rupees, which they could take out 6,000 from.
All right.
So then essentially you have to check we'll have to write this down, the affordability. So using these numbers, I would estimate that 100% of the market could buy this product.
Okay, fair enough. And let's say 30% of the lower class could buy it.
Okay.
And what numbers are we getting?
Okay, I'll just take a moment to add up these numbers.
Over here, the candidate did a good job of justifying why he made the assumption that middle class families could afford to purchase the solar lantern. He estimated what their average monthly income would be, then looked at what are their potential savings, and then compared it with the cost of purchasing a solar lantern upfront or on an EMI scheme. Excuse me.
So we're looking at around 215 million of the population. But there's one factor that we need to take out, that is the number of people per household, since this is a product which we use per household. So can we assume 4 people per household?
I guess 5 is a more reasonable number for rural.
So just we have to divide by 5. That will come out to around 43 million. 43 million is the market size. Okay, so looking back at the profit formula, we'll have to next measure the market share.
Okay.
What percentage of market we can expect to capture within the first 2 years. So for this, we'll have to benchmark with what products currently exist and whether we have any competitors at the moment.
So at the moment, we don't have any direct competitors who are selling solar lanterns in the country.
Okay, so this is a relatively new product. It's a completely different product. So what do families currently use as an alternative to this?
What do you think would be the alternatives?
So I think alternatives would probably be things like emergency lights, or I think that's probably the one major alternative. Essentially, whenever electricity is not available, what people would use.
Yeah.
So alright, so essentially.
But emergency lights also require to be charged by electricity, right?
Right. So we'll have to compare whether our product is.
So what is your thoughts on that?
So our product requires 6 hour charge for 8 hours of illumination. So do we have similar idea of what would be the charging time and the illumination time for an emergency light?
So a typical emergency light requires an hour of charge and then it lasts for around 6 hours.
Okay. Well, 1 hour is quite low compared to our 6 hour charging requirement. So essentially, we have to see whether families actually have 6 hours of charge, 6 hours of electricity during the day at least. If that is the case, then they have.
So our solar lantern is actually powered by the sun, right? So
Right. So you won't actually require electricity at all, right?
correct.
Okay. So essentially, it can be charged throughout the day, and
Absolutely.
also, does a family pay for the electricity that they use?
For the electricity, sorry,
For example,
I didn't understand
right
your
now,
question.
so the emergency light requires a 1 hour charging time.
Right.
So that would essentially they'll be using certain units of electricity.
Yeah,
which they're
they
allocated
pay for it. Yes.
So the solar lantern would not have that similar cost attached.
Yes.
Okay, so in terms, and so one more benchmark that we can use against emergency lights is how easy is it to use as compared to an emergency light?
Mm-hmm.
Like how would a person operate it and whether it's easy to.
The candidate could have exercised better business judgment here. The primary market for the solar lanterns would be areas which have no source of electricity supply. These are places in India which are off the electricity grid, and these were the places he considered while estimating the market size previously. Hence, emergency lights would not be a viable solution for people living in these areas because an emergency light requires electricity availability in the first place so that it can be used later when the electricity supply goes off. Instead, the candidate could have identified that this is a unique proposition that we are providing to customers. Since there is not much in the face of competition, both direct and indirect. Fairly easy, you just put on the switch and you can use the lantern.
So it's pretty much as easy as using an emergency light.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So in terms of its efficiency, in terms of the.
So, Ashay, what is your hypothesis out here? What are you trying to estimate?
So I want to see whether our product would outmatch the existing alternatives.
Yes.
And if that is the case, then we can expect to capture a higher market share.
Correct. So I think the two products, emergency light and solar lantern, they really target different spaces. One is dependent on a population which already is plugged into electricity, whereas our solar lantern is targeted towards a population that doesn't have electricity in the first place.
Okay.
So I don't think emergency light would be a viable alternative for them.
So for those families that do not use emergency lights, do we know what they currently use as an alternative?
What do you think it could be?
Okay.
We're talking about families which don't have electricity.
Well, typically, the only time they would require lighting is during the night, if at all. I'm not entirely sure apart from emergency lights.
So I guess apart from candles, etc., they really don't have any options
Right, exactly.
as of now.
Okay, so then this would definitely be something highly favorable
Right.
to that entire market then.
I think so, yes.
So given that it's favorable to the large portion of the market, can we estimate a higher market share percentage such as 40 to 50% in those first 2 years?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption.
So
Though what we have seen with similar kinds of electronic products is that often when a new electronic gadget is introduced, which is accepted by the population, there are often cheaper knockoffs that start appearing on the horizon.
Okay, so the one thing we'll have to check is whether our product would be favorable taking into account those cheaper alternatives as well. So since most of this market would be highly price sensitive, we'll have to see whether whether they would choose our product over these cheaper alternatives. So can we check whether can we benchmark our product against these alternatives?
Yes, so we know that compared to the cheaper alternative, our price would be about 1.5 times more. But we will be able to provide a 6 hour, we will be able to provide an 8 hour illumination on full charge,
Okay.
while they'll only be able to provide a 2 hour illumination.
Okay. So for a similar charging time.
Right.
So the price may be one concern given that it's a high price sensitive market. But when we look at how the output, then the price versus the cost versus benefit is much higher for our product.
Right.
So if we can effectively market this product to that market, to that entire market,
All right.
then we can expect to capture a high market share.
Yeah.
So given assuming that we can figure out a marketing strategy,
Right.
so I think 40% of the 40 to 50% of the market can be expected in the first.
But that was your estimate initially, right? Right. After the
Okay, so it would decrease after this.
yes.
This
So let's say 30% of the market.
after reducing.
Right. Here, instead of coming to a direct conclusion, the candidate asked the right questions to judge the impact of knockoffs on market share, and then came to a reasonable conclusion that the impact can largely be curtailed. So, although our share is 100%, we can expect to make a sale of 40-50%, and some of it we'll lose it.
Yeah, quickly due to these alternatives.
So, around 30% of the market.
Okay. All right. So given that we now have an estimate for market share, the next step would be to check the price minus variable cost and see how much the profit.
All right. So we know we'll make around 600 rupees per solar lantern.
Okay. So this is taking into account the variable cost for the product.
Yes. So our variable cost is around 5,400.
Okay. And do we have a fixed cost? Our initial investment, can we assume? Do we have an idea how much our investment?
So we
will
can
cost?
keep the fixed costs aside for the moment, and we can calculate our profit pool based on this.
Okay, so it looks like we can expect a total profit of 7.8 billion rupees. Essentially, 43 million is the market size that we initially estimated into 30% market share, into 600 for profit per unit.
Right.
That would come out to around 7.8 billion rupees.
All right. Fine. So that looks good. What should we do next?
Okay, so it looks like the business will be profitable. We have a reasonable, significant estimate for the profit. Next, we'll have to check the value chain and see whether we can actually implement this entire business.
Sounds like a good idea.
Okay. So at this point, I'd like to look at the three aspects, that will be production, distribution, and retail. So does the client currently operate in any one of these regions, or are we looking at the entire spectrum from production to retail?
So why don't you tell us what would be the best strategy? Which part of the value chain should we enter into?
Okay, great. So then we'll just look at each of these aspects individually and see where we can fit in. So starting with production. So I'd like to see how our client currently manufactures the product in Germany and whether we can repeat the same kind of production technique in India.
So yes, we can. We have the capability to produce. That's not a challenge.
So the capability can we produce the entire requirement to satisfy that demand?
Yes, I think you mentioned 43 million units over a period of 2 years. We'll be able to fulfill that.
Okay, great. All right, so looks like production won't be much of a challenge.
Right.
And next will be distribution. So essentially, since we're looking at rural population, distribution may
Right.
be something that is a little bit difficult to do.
Yes, as of now, we don't have a distribution network.
So how does the client currently operate in Germany with respect
So
to distribution?
as of now, in Germany, we have our own distribution network. So we have our own trucks and warehouses through which we supply our products. Sorry, this is not in Germany, but this is in other areas in developing countries where we have a presence. In India, however, we don't have a presence.
Okay. So that would be something that would take time to develop that entire network.
If we had to develop it on our own, it would take at least 3 years.
To develop it ourselves. Okay. So we would 3 years is quite a challenge. I mean, that is a very long time frame. So we could look at whether there are alternatives in terms of existing players who could do the distribution for us, third parties. But we'll come back to distribution as that's one of the challenging areas. We'll just take a look at retail and see whether that is also a place. Another concern. So again, similar to to distribution, how do we currently retail in other developing countries?
So we typically have these small electronic retailers in any particular store which are selling a cell phone, etc.
Okay.
And those are the places where our lantern also gets stocked.
So this is something that would currently exist. There would
Yes.
obviously be many stores already in
Right.
existence.
Right.
So it looks like there are outlets that we can retail through.
Correct.
So retail would not be much of a challenge.
Right.
So it looks
So
like
I think this is great. I think we've made a lot of headway into this particular case question. All right. Thank you so much, Ashay. Thanks for your time. So at the end of this case, let's look at the positives and areas of improvement coming out. In terms of positives, firstly, the candidate gave a very good explanation of the overall approach to solve the market entry case. Secondly, he had very good written communication, which allowed the interviewer to always stay in sync with the candidate. Thirdly, the candidate was also very well structured while estimating the market size. And lastly, he avoided making any calculation errors. In terms of areas of improvement, initially the candidate could have asked more and better preliminary questions. And secondly, there were parts in the case where the candidate could have exercised better business judgment, especially when trying and coming up with what could be the potential market share for the client.